Allora,
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the meeting and welcome to this session. We wanted to start this session with a video, but unfortunately, because of some royalty issues, we couldn't. So instead, we will start with a little experiment. Let's do a test. You all have a smartphone, isn't it? Take your smartphone and try to Google bubble dance robot video. Oh, sorry, not bubbles. Bolle. Roberto Bolle dances robot. Try. I don't know, maybe it's like committing suicide because starting a session with such a request may be a bit counterproductive, but maybe somebody who is following us from home through the web streaming knows what I'm talking about. I'm asking you to watch a short video taken from a TV show made by dancer Roberto Bolle for the Italian TV, and you can see Roberto Bolle, the dancer who dances with a robot. So have a look, and you will immediately understand why we wanted to start our session with that video. But instead, we're asking you to watch the video individually because there is something extremely fascinating and charming in those moves, but also something, upsetting and disturbing and somehow something that leads to some sort of concern. Well, it's charming, but at the same time worrying somehow. Also, the very same idea that all together, by using technology, we can watch something individually, but all together in the same place. But everybody is looking at the screen by themselves. So there is a sort of individual sort of watching, but in a collective space. So please, especially to ladies, stop watching Roberto Bolle, please. And so do not switch to Facebook. Please come back to us. Come back to the reason of our conference here today, and you will immediately understand this sort of match between worry and fascination and wonder, because this is something that perfectly characterizes our relation to technology, especially technology that has such a big impact on our lives. Today we're talking about artificial intelligence and the human element. So we talk about AI, but also it's overlapping with the biotechnologies and sort of neurosciences. It is something that has trickled down into our lives. It's so strictly intertwined with so many incredible opportunities that may come from science and technology that somehow we sort of are worried but charmed. And some things that we thought impossible have become true. Let's think about algorithms and machines. Well, not only let machines do things in our place, because robots have been existing for some time. Now robots can also dance and replace us. But today robots can also make decisions. Machines can make decisions. Some people state that machines can also think in our place, so we can entrust decisions to machines, like for instance a navigator. Let's think about satellite navigation. Well, the satellite navigator chooses the best pathway for us, and the timeline of social networks is settled by algorithms. And not only that, but also recruitment is made through these tools in order to make an initial choice. or insurance tariffs may depend from an algorithms or insurance rates. But also when it comes to rulings, well, in the US, there are special softwares that are used to calculate the sort of probability likelihood of relapses and repeating a certain crime in order to decide the kind of sanction to be somehow to be ruled. And then there are some extremes that result from that, because some people start to think about something that is becoming more possible, likelier and likelier, that is the following. So it may be possible to somehow extend sort of human abilities. So, well, theoretically, this is sort of limitless. Some people say that and argue that in the future, people will be able to use technologies that will also include the integration of man with machines to become more powerful, more capable of so many things. And this may sound crazy, but we will hear some examples later on. So thinking about expanding our possibilities, so being able to somehow extract our mind and our abilities and upload it onto another device or medium, because it's conceived as a set of connections, and somehow this is something that sounds like madness, but actually this is something on which big companies are investing millions of dollars, and these are topics in which companies are sort of making research. And on top of that, there is something real relating to all these topics. This has to do with a deep sort of desire to sort of go beyond our limits and our somehow constraints. The idea is to push limits forward and forward. This is something that always characterized man since the beginning of history. But today, the difference is that all those incredible things seem possible. So some people say that we may live very, very long, so hundreds of years, and get so old. So again, this raises such a wide number of issues. It has to do with our frailty. And so that's why today we want to talk about the human element in artificial intelligence. And for this, we have invited the following guests. So, first of all, Daniele Magazzeni to my left. Please, a round of applause for him to welcome him. He has been studying artificial intelligence, is also associate professor in artificial intelligence at King's College London. Well, I won't dwell on all his qualifications, but he's associate professor. So really, this is his cup of tea, so to speak. And well, the inspiration came mostly for this wonderful trip, for this great journey, is Mark O'Connell. So here to my right is Irish, comes from Dublin, and who made this incredible journey that resulted into this book, To Be a Machine, that is sort of journeying about the most extreme forms of what I've talked to you about. It is about transhumanism, so theories and ideas of people that are working to somehow make people go beyond their limits and boundaries. We're going to listen more about the journey. The third guest is somebody that you certainly know very well. Is a piece of meeting, Mr. Costantino Esposito. He's full professor of history of philosophy at the University of Bari. And again, we are going also to delve into this topic with him too. But I would like to start with Professor Magazzeni. So, Professor Magazzeni, you have the $1 million question to start with. So, Daniele, what are we talking about when we talk about artificial intelligence? Please try to sort of paint this complex picture. It's not that easy in such a short time, but please, let's have a try. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I would like to thank the meeting for inviting me here. I would like to thank you for participating. So before answering Davide's question, I would like to make a preliminary remark because I have been invited here to speak as expert on artificial intelligence, I must confess that every day with my students and with my team, I started to develop new forms and techniques of AI. So it's my job, it's my passion. I make a living out of it, and certainly I can consider myself as an expert in that respect. But the more I go forward with my research on AI, the more I'm amazed by human intelligence, and I'm amazed of the great potential of human intelligence, because any human being is capable potentially to do so many things. And so the AIs try to be a sort of reproduction, a sort of analogy, a pale analogy of human intelligence. So this is somehow the guiding light of my research, and that's why I decided to accept this invitation. So in 15 minutes, I have to tell you what AI is about. So this is a buzzword today. I think that the most important thing is try to be as sort of realistic as possible. So, but first of all, considering the limited time that we have and considering the fact that I'm not talking to experts, I'll try to be as streamlined and somehow simple as possible in order to give you a flavor of what AI is about. So I start with the quote. Okay. So AI may be compared to electricity. So in terms of impact and extent of this impact, because AI is expanding so much the ability of man to interact with reality, the same electricity did. Let's think about the facility we have today when it comes to exchanging information or communicating. So electricity, the same way, had such a big impact. And also AI, something we use continuously, and somehow we use it almost in an unconscious way. Because if I were to quote AI, you may think about these brands and products. So these products and brands that you see on this screenshot are things that let us have access to information. So information is mediated through AI, because when you look for a piece of information on the internet, when you Google it, or what you do with social media is always mediated by AI. It's important to be aware of that. Secondly, all of these products share another important thing. They are free. But sometimes when things are free and given for free, it's because the real product is us, because these companies then use our data to make business, to optimize, for instance, advertisements. So it's important to keep that in mind, because then we can be more aware of the implications and repercussions of our interaction with technology. Basically, AI works in two ways. I'll just be a bit technical. So we have a model-based mode. Let's think about checkers. And you can move, chess, sorry. You can move the elements in different ways. But certainly, you should consider the different possibilities and find the best strategy when it comes to chess and chess playing. So this is what we do continuously. This is about planning. So AI simply tries, on the one hand, to carry out many, many operations in very few seconds. But considering that it is almost impossible to have a picture of all possibilities, it's important to select the most promising ones and focus on those. So let's take chess and let's move to Google Maps. So we use it on a daily basis. We have the model, the network, the road network, and so algorithm try to find, according to different metrics, the most efficient way to reach a certain destination. So we have AI algorithms developing this application. The same approach is adopted to robotics. This is a video by Boston Dynamics. It's quite famous. And as a scientist, I can tell you that these videos are quite extraordinary because they illustrate a high level of progress that has been made in robotics. So you see that there are high-performing robots that can develop a certain dynamic and can also have the ability to carry out complex dynamic actions as humans would do. But there is something else, something that you may just skip by watching the video. All of these robots are carrying out tasks that are still somehow defined by humans. So these robots can just do things. They can take up a box, they can walk, but actually the goal is set by man, by human beings. Otherwise, you may think that we are in a Terminator-like scenario or that robot may overcome us. No, not at all, because when it comes to taking initiative, and I mean, this is something that AI hasn't got yet. It is still a human factor. And also, I want to try to be a bit sort of reality-oriented. Well, so much has been made in self-driving cars, and there are huge investments that are still made, but certainly there is a human element problem, because even though technology is ready or will be ready very soon for self-driving cars, there's a trust-related issues, because people will have to develop a certain level of trust to sit in a car and let the car self-drive itself. And developing the trust will require some time, leaving aside the cultural implications and social implications. But then there is another big approach of AI that is quite well known. It's the neural network-based approach. So what is that about? The main goal is, again, to simulate and let's say emulate what men do when they use their own neural networks. And I know that during this year's edition of the meeting, there is a special section on that. But still, to be rather clear, there are huge databases and huge databases, for instance, of images to develop image recognition abilities. So there are loads and loads and loads, millions of images that have been labeled. We have millions of pictures of dogs, of cats, of cars. So the idea is to train the neural networks with these codes so that after watching 1 million cars, 1 million dogs, 1 million cats, when an AI form is presented with a new image, will understand through its neural network if this is about a cat, a dog, or a car. So, in other words, AI neural networks work that way. So they need to be hugely trained and practice a lot by making use of huge quantities of data. So today, the computational power has increased so much with respect to 20 years ago. So today, in the network, there are so many available data, much, much more than 20 years ago. And we're also feeding those data into the network. And there can be different applications, for instance, in the medical sector. So neural networks can be used, and several approaches are used in that respect, for instance, for diagnosis purposes, for screening purposes, and then we have facial recognition on social network, but also we have security applications and Google Translate. Have you ever asked yourself how Google Translate works? Well, then there are loads of examples of already translated examples. So neural networks try to learn from those examples and then try to somehow reproduce those examples. Here you see a real horse on the left and to the right a fake zebra. So simply the motion was reproduced. The video to the right is a fake video. So everybody is worrying about fake news, but the real problem is the future fake artifacts or fake videos created by AI. Well, the same was done on man. Well, it's not the right time to show it to you, but the same was done with man, so with human beings. So this is something that people who deal with AI know that was a landmark moment. This is the scene reproducing AlphaGo, an AI algorithm that beats a very complex, beats a human person in a very complex game called in the chess field. So everybody thought that many years would have been required to have a machine play sort of a human in this game. But then an algorithm was able to beat a human being, and that had a big impact in the scientific community, and not only because an algorithm was able to beat a human in this game, in this chess-related game. And I always also show this slide because this shows what is behind the algorithm AlphaGo and the Korean champion of Go, Lee Sedol. So there are hundreds of processors, hundreds of scientists, and years of training and practicing of this code. Behind Lee Sedol, there is a brain and a cup of coffee. Moreover, and it's very important to say that, AlphaGo, the algorithm, can play just Go. It can't play anything else. Even if you add a line to the game, AlphaGo have no idea to start with, how to start. Lee Sedol can do so many things, can love his children, can cook, can do plenty of things. So actually, the real brain that still fascinates me is the human brain between the two, not the other one, not the artificial one. This is an experiment that has been done recently. A neural network that had to recognize different animals was asked to classify those images. So the idea was to have a 57% confidence rate about sort of previewing a certain outcome. In this case, the neural network was right. It guessed a panda, and then it was necessary to identify that image from a single pixel. It is so small, it's teeny weeny. So, but then by watching the pixel, so the neural network said that the picture was not a panda, but it was from a monkey, from a gibbon. And this is a big limit for artificial intelligence. So in this case, it got it wrong. So it is not that clear to why sometimes algorithm of AI behave in a certain way. We do not know why, in the first case, the artificial intelligence was able to acknowledge the panda, but in the second case, it didn't recognize the panda from the pixel, but it said it was a gibbon. So we say that AI is a black box. So when I ask a person, why are you saying that? Well, that person can answer, but AI is not able to do so. That's why within the AI sector, there is an area of research that is called Explainable AI. So trying to develop techniques likely to explain the reason behind the choices and decisions of AI, because without that, there's a huge gap. And that is a limit. How many of you know these people? How many of you know these people? That would be interesting to ask you this. But actually, these three people do not exist. These faces have been created by AI. And again, if you visit this website, this person does not exist.com, every time you will see new faces. And every time those faces will be about people that do not exist. I'm about to end. And I'm saying that just to raise a topic. Many people in the scientific community have described this result as sort of a creative side of AI. So the fact that AI can create and therefore can think. But, well, somehow I may agree to a certain extent, but I also want to be thought-provoking on one element specifically. There is something that distinguishes man from AI, that is intuition, because AI can work in such a way because it's been programmed in a certain way or because it learns from a huge number of examples. But intuition has nothing to do with that. Human intuition, certainly to a certain extent, depends on what you went through, to your past experiences and background. But intuition is like a surprise. It's like discovering something, between establishing a connection between something that comes from your experience and something new. It's like an epiphany. So this is what, in my opinion, distinguishes AI from human beings. Right. So I would like to end up with 2 more slides. The first one is about Facebook and whiskey. What's the connection? A dear friend of mine sort of works for one of the companies that I showed you in one of the previous slides. So we meet up in London from time to time and have dinner together. And we had a conversation recently about the fact that technology, by definition, is neutral. Actually, he argued that AI and technology are neutral. I do not agree with that. Well, this is my opinion, because he sat and argued. We had smartphones on the table and a whiskey bottle. And he said, well, Facebook is like whiskey. Whiskey is neutral. It's up to you to decide how much to drink it and to use it wisely or badly. Well, I do not agree with this statement, because between Facebook and whiskey, there are at least 3 main differences. At least 3. The first one is that that's a very good whiskey. So you need to have 120 quids to buy one, while Facebook is free. If you drink a whole bottle of whiskey, you may collapse. Instead, you can use Facebook for 20 hours in a row and do not see any damage. If you sort of drink whiskey, the person next to you, especially if you drink a lot, will acknowledge that. But nobody will ever ask you how much Facebook you have used and acknowledge if you have used it a lot. So again, you see that using social networks is something that makes people a bit very vulnerable, because it's like if people were not ready to use it. I say it because somehow people say, okay, the difference is made by how you use things, but it's not so true, because, I mean, if such a sort of a quick development of science does not go hand in hand with an appropriate and equal development of consciousness, well, there's something wrong. I mean, the curiosity of showing what you're doing, or sometimes is something that it's weird. I mean, or the fact that people use it so much. I do not want to somehow to sort of talk about AI in a negative way. This is not my intention, but we need to pay attention about the way we use social networks. So I want to finish with this. I was in the pilot cabin recently, and I asked the pilot a very important question to me. During a flight, the pilot is in charge and control of the plane just for 3% of the whole flying time. And this 3% includes the landing. So a few minutes before landing, the pilot deactivates the self-pilot mode and takes control of the plane. And so I asked the commander, the pilot, why do you take the responsibility of doing some manual landing? Because the autopilot would be perfectly able to do the landing, but pilots decide to take up the responsibility of making manual landing. And the pilot answered in a very convincing way and said, because we need to sort of to keep practicing. Otherwise, if one day for any reason the autopilot won't work, well, we won't be able to sort of make a plane land. So we may risk to lose that ability. And so these answers still resound somehow in my mind, and so it's still with me today, because I think we should follow the sort of pilot tips in many aspects of our lives. We should keep many of our abilities trained and still practice them. Let's think about the ability of sort of remembering things by heart, or our ability to calculate, or to sort of get self-orientation without a navigator. So we should keep ourselves well-trained. And allow me to say, and from this point of view, the mating is a great example of that. I mean, we will need to keep our sort of love for human relationships and for real friendship alive, because real friendship is made of dinner spent together, affection, love, expression of love. But faced with such a huge and quick growth of AI, that may sound sort of surreal, but certainly I need that we should keep our love for real human relationships alive. And so we have the responsibility to keep ourselves well trained. And this is a huge, great, fascinating education responsibility. I thank you very much for your attention.
Marco Connell invece ha fatto un viaggio nel mondo di chi pensa che quel 3%.
Marco Connell instead made a journey among those who think that 3% can be overcome, and it is a duty to overcome that so that humanity can approach unimaginable frontiers. The book, as I said before, has been a journey in transhumanism, that is the humanity that is awaiting us according to the prophets of an extreme use of technology. No whiskey, no coffee, but what Mark is going to tell us about. Why have we invited him? Because, as we said before, these positions that are so extreme can really help us see very clearly what is the big underlying issue that Daniele has already mentioned in his intervention. So please, Mark, tell us about your journey in the world of transhumanism.
Thank you, Davide. Thank you very much. My book, To Be a Machine, Essere una Macchina, is about people known as transhumanists who believe that we can and should use technology to push out the boundaries of the human condition. That the future of humanity will involve upgrading our minds and our bodies using implants, uploading our consciousnesses to machines, merging with artificial intelligence to become immortal beings of near infinite intelligence and power. It sounds like science fiction, but there are people working toward making this strange techno-utopian dream a reality, and I've met a lot of them. But before I say much more about the movement itself and its vision of the future of humanity, I want to say a little bit about how I came to this topic, why I was drawn to it. I don't think of myself as a science writer. I have a PhD in English literature and my background is as a literary critic. I've always been especially interested in art and mythology that tries to get to the root of the strangeness of being human, in particular the existential motherlode of anxiety about our mortality. And I've been obsessed for years with the biblical story of the fall, which for me is an incredibly rich and profound poetic account of our own strangeness to ourselves, our own inability to accept ourselves as the animals we are. The psychological center of the story for me is the notion that we weren't supposed to be this way, that we were meant to be exempt from suffering and death and human frailty, and that we brought this condition on ourselves as a punishment. Fundamentally, what's always been most fascinating to me is the idea that our own nature, our own human limitations, are something to be transcended. This inability to reconcile ourselves to the irreducible facts of our humanity has always been, in some sense, a defining aspect of the human condition. And when my son was born 6 years ago now, I found myself thinking about this stuff a lot. The experience of watching my wife give birth and of being partly responsible for the existence and continued well-being of this tiny, fragile little human led to a period of obsession with this mortality and fragility. And it was around this point that I started reading a lot about this movement, transhumanism, which explicitly offered a way out of this mortality and fragility, a way of transcending our condition through technology. I was initially so fascinated by it because it seemed to me to arise out of the same basic existential unease with the human condition that lay beneath the story of the fall and beneath my own increasing preoccupation with these things. And so although it took me to some very strange places, into encounters with ideas I often found very troubling and very alien, the book itself had its genesis, so to speak, in an irreducible core of identification, of sympathy. I didn't like where transhumanists wanted to take us, but I got where they were coming from. And so I spent on and off about 2 years traveling around Europe and America, meeting these people, attending their gatherings, encountering their sometimes unsettling ideas, investigating the technologies that they believed would make the vision of the future possible. As you can imagine, I met a lot of fascinating and eccentric people in this time, but as far as it sounds and is, this movement and its ideas have taken root very firmly in the soil of Silicon Valley, which is, of course, a sort of central node of our entire culture. Some high-profile examples. In 2014, the Google founders set up a biotechnology research and development firm called Calico Laboratories, which is explicitly aimed at finding solutions at the level of genetics to what they consider to be the problem of human aging. Peter Thiel, the billionaire venture capitalist who co-founded PayPal, has invested significant amounts of money in the project of achieving immortality through technology. Many of the people and projects that I encountered through my book were funded by one or other of Thiel's various venture capital arms. And Elon Musk, Thiel's former PayPal colleague, has spoken publicly about his conviction that the rise of AI is something that will lead inexorably to our becoming obsolete as a species. That AI will evolve as far above us as we have evolved over the lower primates, and that the only way we can avoid this fate is by taking evolution into our own hands, developing the power of brain-machine interfaces and merging our minds with artificial intelligence. In an interview last year, Musk spoke about his recently founded company Neuralink, aimed at achieving exactly this. The desired end result of this, he said, was that anyone who wants can have superhuman cognition. He didn't outline any kind of price structure, but presumably he meant anyone who could afford it. Because this is one of the most pressing questions around this entire topic. As much as transhumanists tend to talk about these future technologies as making an existential transformation in the species as a whole, it's worth thinking about the likelihood that only a small and already very privileged group of people would ever benefit. And what kind of world would that be? A world in which the super rich transcend their humanity and leave the rest of us to founder in a state of biological impoverishment. There were times in writing my book when it seemed to me that as much as it was oriented toward the future, transhumanism presented a sometimes nightmarish intensification of the way things already are in this world. One of my first encounters with transhumanism out in the world as a reporter was a visit to a place on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, called Alcor Life Extension Foundation, which is the largest of the world's 4 cryonics facilities. Cryonics is the science, or to put it perhaps more accurately, pseudoscience, although I've been criticized for using that term, so perhaps I shouldn't. It's the science of preserving recently deceased human bodies with the specific intention of thawing them at some point in the future. Maybe 50 years from now, maybe 500, when technological progress has become sufficiently advanced that those preserved corpses can be brought back to life. When I visited, I was brought on a tour of the facility, and I was taken into the sterile surgical environment with the recently deceased people, and they're referred to as patients, by the way, never corpses, have their bodily fluids replaced with a kind of high-grade antifreeze that's supposed to prevent cell degradation. In most cases, the preparation for cryonic suspension involves the patient being beheaded. Basically, it's cheaper to have your head preserved. They call it the cephalon to give it a linguistic veneer of scientific respectability and to distract from the fact that they're talking about severed heads. Heads take up less space than whole bodies in the storage drawers, and most transhumanists aren't that interested in returning to their life in their old, wrinkly, diseased bodies. What they want is to have their heads thawed, their brains removed, and their preserved minds scanned and uploaded to computers, and then transferred to humanoid robots or some other platform. This is how most transhumanists tend to envision eternal life. Many of us console ourselves with the thought that, as the poet Philip Larkin's much-quoted line puts it, what will survive of us is love. Transhumanism offers us something different and much less abstract. What will survive of us, in this view, is data. What will survive of us is code. It offers us a vision of the future in which our minds will be translated into zeros and ones and transferred from the flesh and blood of our bodies to an entirely different platform, uploaded to machines. The concept of mind uploading is a central article of faith among transhumanists, and it's key to the whole post-human immortal future. One of the most prominent advocates of transhumanist ideas is Ray Kurzweil, a director of engineering at Google. In 2005, Kurzweil published a book called The Singularity is Near, in which he outlines how in the very near future, he says by the year 2045, artificial intelligence is going to become so sophisticated and so powerful that we will be able to upload our minds to AI supercomputers and merge with this technology in a final liberation from biology itself. The picture Kurzweil paints of the future is one in which technology continues to get smaller and more powerful until such time as its accelerating evolution becomes the primary agent of our own evolution as a species. We will no longer carry computers around with us, he reveals, but rather take them into our bodies, into our brains and bloodstreams, thereby changing the nature of the human experience. Kurzweil's vision of the future is, I think, primarily attractive to people who already think of themselves in a way as machines. People who agree with the AI pioneer Marvin Minsky that the human brain happens to be a meat machine. Why would we, machines that we ultimately are, not choose to upgrade ourselves to a higher degree of functionality, to attain what Elon Musk calls superhuman cognition? If we understand a machine to be an apparatus constructed for the performance of a particular task, then our task as machines is surely to think, to compute at the highest level possible. In this highly instrumentalist view of human life, it's more or less our duty, pretty much the whole point of our existing in the first place, to increase our computational power and to ensure that as machines we run as efficiently as possible for as long as possible. This is Kurzweil in The Singularity is Near. Our version 1.0 biological bodies are frail and subject to a myriad of failure modes, not to mention the cumbersome maintenance rituals they require. While human intelligence is sometimes capable of soaring in its creativity and expressiveness, much human thought is derivative, petty, and circumscribed. The singularity will allow us to transcend these limitations of our biological bodies and brains. We'll gain power over our fates. Our mortality will be in our own hands. We'll be able to live as long as we want, a subtly different statement from saying we will live forever. We will fully understand human thinking and will vastly extend and expand its reach. By the end of this century, the non-biological portion of our intelligence will be trillions of times more powerful than unaided human intelligence. Kurzweil has thought about the idea that such a merger would obliterate our humanity and answers it by saying that it would, on the contrary, be an ultimate vindication of the very quality that's always defined and distinguished humans as a species, our constant yearning for a transcendence of our physical and mental limitations. This idea of uploading ourselves to machines has been around for decades in science fiction, but it's a thing that people, particularly people in Silicon Valley, believe will become a reality and are actively pursuing. At a transhumanist conference in the Bay Area, at the very beginning of doing reporting for my book, I was introduced to a man named Randall Coonan. Randall is a computational neuroscientist whose entire life's work is figuring out how uploading a human mind to a machine might be possible. He's among the most fascinating people I've ever met. He's engaged in a project that seems on the face of it completely insane, but he's a tremendous communicator and quite a charismatic man in his way. And when I was with him, I kept having these moments where I would be listening to him very intently, trying to get my head around some technical matter he was explaining to me, and I'd feel close to getting a handle on it, and then I would suddenly pull back and be hit by the feeling that what Randall was talking about was utterly mad, utterly unhinged, that if he achieved what he had dedicated himself to achieving, it would amount to the most profound transformation in the entire history of humanity. That it would actually, in a very real sense, mean the end of humanity. Randall, for his part, was very good at bracketing those kinds of thoughts. It wasn't that he was unconcerned by those apocalyptic questions. He was even intrigued by them in his way. But in our conversations, I felt that I was always the one to remind him of them. It was as though they weren't really his concern, as though they were only of secondary relevance to what he was doing. He was very narrowly focused on finding a scientific solution to a clearly defined problem. The problem in this case being that of embodiment, of human minds being contained within human bodies. Randall described himself as an architect, which meant that he wasn't involved in conducting original research, but that his work was all about collating various pieces of research across the fields of neuroscience and technology, research that would be relevant to the eventual achievement of brain uploading. I'm going to oversimplify here to a pretty drastic degree, for which I'm happy to blame the strictures of the 15-minute talk format. But the basic principle of the idea is that the entire infrastructure of consciousness, the firing of individual neurons, the vast map of connections between those neurons, the whole dynamic picture of a living mind, can be represented as information. It's all essentially reducible to data, and that data can be rendered as computational code. And that code, like a software, can theoretically be extracted from the hardware on which it's currently run, which is to say the brain, and adapted to run on some other form of hardware, like an AI supercomputer or a human-shaped robot. Now, there's serious uncertainty, needless to say, and some extreme skepticism around the question of whether this could ever be possible. The majority of neuroscientists, and I would venture the majority of AI researchers, see it as an extremely remote prospect, although I did speak to some who think that it's theoretically achievable. And quite aside from the questions of plausibility, there are the philosophical questions of whether the mind that would be uploaded to a machine would in any sense be you. Would it be more like a simulacrum, a kind of identical mind twin? I discussed all these questions at length with Randall, and he was as curious about it as I was, but he was ultimately far more focused on the question of how it could be achieved than on the philosophical implications of achieving it. One of the key ideas in any consideration of these proposed future technologies is the notion of obsolescence. Transhumanists, when they speak about the human body, the fleshy hardware on which we run the software of our minds, tend to speak of it as an outmoded technology. We are already machines in this view, it's just that we happen to be hopelessly antiquated machines. Machines that were designed for use on the African savannah 200,000 years ago, and which are just not sufficiently up to date for the requirements of contemporary life. That flesh, in other words, is a dead format. This notion of the human body as an obsolete technology seems at first very strange, almost alien. It's a disturbing way of thinking about human life, or at least it was to me when I began to encounter it, and in many ways it still is. But if you think about it in terms of certain anxieties that underlie the relationship between human beings and technology, then it comes to make an odd kind of sense. One of the great shadows of fear and uncertainty that falls over our time is caused by the looming tide of automation that is rushing towards us. It's difficult to overstate the scale of the social and economic upheavals that artificial intelligence could bring. A great many jobs, whole sectors of the employment economy may well become obsolete as more and more areas of human skill and expertise become synthesized by machines. Increasingly, we live in a world governed by systems we struggle to understand. At the highest level, stock markets fluctuate in response to the unknowable whims of algorithms. At a lower level, you have Amazon warehouses where pots and pans are shelved next to books, televisions are shelved with children's toys. It's a system that makes no sense to the stock pickers who are employed to wander the warehouses, taking direction from handheld devices, but it makes perfect sense to the AI algorithm that dictates the shelving and directs the humans. Increasingly, the systems by which we navigate the world make sense only with the aid of machines. How likely is it to come to pass, this proposed merger of humans and machines? How likely are we to wind up living in a world where Elon Musk is providing us, or our social betters, with the means towards what he calls superhuman cognition? Throughout what I've been saying this evening, I think it's probably implicit that I'm skeptical about transhumanism, about its aims and assumptions. I'm not a scientist, and I don't claim to be a futurist. I'm not someone, in other words, with any special presumption to expertise in the area. other than I spent a couple of years hanging out with people who are deeply invested in this particular vision of the future. For what it's worth, I find it hard to imagine that the singularity, the sort of grand merger of human and machine intelligence imagined by Kurzweil and others, is in fact near. But in any case, I never really conceived of my book as being about the future per se. What has always interested me about the future, as an idea, as a fantasy, as a nightmare, is what it can tell us about the present. Transhumanism presents a vision of imminent and radical change in the human condition. In the case of the singularity, this vision is almost explicitly apocalyptic. The rapture of the nerds, as it's often referred to, amounts to a vision of the end of humanity as we know it, and the beginning of something strange and new, and at least in the mind of its adherents, utterly wonderful. But apocalyptic visions always tell us a lot more about the time in which they were written than they do about the future. The book of Revelation, to take probably the most famous example, reveals an awful lot more about the time of upheaval and violence and religious persecution in which it was written than it does about the future. And I think the singularity, the idea of this merger of machine and human intelligence, tells us more about the world we are currently inhabiting than it does about any potential future. One of the transhumanists I met while I was writing my book asked me a question that stuck with me. It was late one night, and we were sitting around drinking beers in his basement and talking about the future. And he had his iPhone in his hand. And he lifted it up towards me and he said, "What if we're already living in the singularity?" It's a question I think about a lot. Because maybe the singularity is nothing more and nothing less than a myth about the present, an elaborate story that illuminates how things already are, how they've in some sense always been. Because to talk about a merger of humans with technology is simply to talk about being human, in a sense. Because, of course, you can't even begin to try to define what a human being is without speaking about technology. We became human when we started using tools. Maybe the singularity began when the first Neolithic human picked up a rock and bashed it against another rock and made fire. Maybe your existence as a cyborg is affirmed every time your phone buzzes in your pocket with a notification. Every time you navigate your way through the streets of London or Milan by means of a GPS system in your hand, signaling your position to a satellite orbiting the Earth. Maybe it's all a wild allegory for something that has already happened, is always happening. Maybe the singularity, in other words, is already here. Thank you.
Capite perché
Wow. You now understand why I said that this topic is charming, fascinating, but worrying at the same time. As Mark said, so we are thinking about the future, but this rush about the future, what does tell us about the present? Because we want to go beyond our boundaries. We want to expand our human abilities, to transform our humanity somehow. So what is human? What is the human element then? What is our knowledge at the end of the day? What is really our freedom? What is a human element? And again, another 1 million question for Costantino Esposito. The floor is yours. Well, I think that AI is a great challenge that is worth taking up. But we should try to avoid two rather standard reactions. The first one is the following. Well, AI would be an inevitable destiny of our reason. Not very glorious, but somehow the dream of any rationalism would come true. That would be about the dream of not only receiving knowledge and the data of knowledge, being able to acknowledge them, but also to create them. Human thinking is always a little bit artificial. There is no pure form of natural intelligence, because our intelligence gets into things, it modifies things, and somehow shapes things. So it's a two-way connection. So somehow it's artificial, but not in robotic related terms, but in terms of interaction. When Thomas Aquinas, who was not certainly a transhumanist, said that anything that is somehow incorporated by our mind or by our soul is integrated and embodied according to the shape and nature of the entity receiving that. So constructivism is always a bit there. We're always creative. But here we are talking about something else. Here we are talking about this emphatic enthusiasm about the fact that AI may be the irreversible, glorious destiny of reason. So, from scratch, the reason may create its own object. So, it may start for something that is not given, but it may create something simply on the basis of some information. And what would this information be about? Well, any form of rationalism had this ambition. This is something philosophy has been investigating for such a long time. This is something that has been investigated by Hobbes. Hobbes talks about reason as calculation, or it talks about or let's think about Leibniz and what he said about the possibility of having a sort of universal language made of signs. So basically, the idea is that, the world would not be given any longer, so the only fact of being able to think the world would define the world. And as a consequence, defining things means that things can be thought of with no contradictions with any other possible. The idea is to find the key to explain beings in the human mind. But that leads to a problem. And Daniele extensively talked about that when he said, very rightly, that there is something that is not mastered by machines, intuition. But also Mark, philosophically, mentioned the fact that this idea of uploading our brains into machines or sort of robot-like entities, who becomes what? Who is going to be then the subject or object of this change? Are we going to create a new identity, a new entity, a sort of avatar, or a sort of fictional figure, simulacrum? Say, what about the natural identity? Is that purely turned into a machine? Yes or no? What happens? Well, I would reformulate and rephrase the problem in these terms. This, let's say, calculability, allow me to say, process of the world, that is what AI would simply be about, identify the thinking I as a sort of information management function. I'm not saying that the I is not able to manage cognitive functions. I'm simply saying that in this case, cognitive function is such that there is no longer need to postulate the existence of a thinking I, of a smart, brilliant I, as if the thinking I may exist without a thinking subject. So that may lead to another standard reaction that is rather opposite, because on the one hand, we have some sort of unconditional enthusiasm for this kind of evolution. And as Mark said, some transhumanists are really sort of sci-fi oriented, so they're really enthusiastic about this scenario. But another position would be the following. According to another word that Mark mentioned, would be about considering AI as a nightmare. A nightmare. So, a pretension, well, a sort of idea that scares to death, not only because we're already living inside cages. We were talking about this with Daniele, because we are the product, we are paying, and the money we pay with is our information, our data, and we do nothing but increase the amount of data that are used and can be used to somehow implant into our own brains and minds some needs. But on top of that, and even more so, we somehow become useless. What our thinking has generated has become so powerful and almighty that the result of our thinking is going to make the thinking being useless. So we risk to be reduced to procedures, just to sort of computational beings. So the computational ability seems to be the only thing that counts. Reading Mark's book is so interesting, especially, for instance, there is a part about the way how, these authors go back to some old philosophical ideas. And you also mentioned that, because our own intelligence could and should, according to transhumanists, be used to be implanted onto different devices and medium, different from our flesh and our brain and our bodies, so that it could run as a software, well, on a hardware that could be much more suitable, and not just our sort of body, our poor body, our flesh and blood, and well, that could work much better on another carcass somehow. But actually, our body defines ourselves. Our intelligence is always embodied, is always inside the body, and this is what makes each one of us unique. But if our intelligence could and should sort of get rid of this body, well, that would turn into a nightmare. Well, I think that neither the enthusiastic approach nor the sort of fearful approach are the right approaches to get around this topic, because somehow we would limit ourselves to approaches that do not allow us to understand the core issue, because let's not hide it. These sci-fi scenarios somehow seem to be exciting to a certain extent. We are users, but at the same time victims of technology, and at the same time we sometimes are worried by the influence of technology. So the only way to go beyond this either-or approach, well, and I think that this is the most disseminated way by contemporary philosophy, is about thinking a new AI ethics. So an ethics of artificial intelligence, considering that we have this great potential, we have this great opportunity to expand our sort of computational abilities, well, and the computational abilities of our mind, well, then let's lay down some new moral rules, some new ethical rules, because then machines should follow their own ethical rules and comply with them. Well, these kind of concerns that are absolutely legitimate should not sort of make us forget that the very first question is a cognitive question, is a knowledge-related question, because ironically, the AI issue, and well, that was also said by Daniele, forces us to, first of all, define intelligence. What is natural intelligence? And a colleague of mine, who is an AI teacher at an Italian university, told me that, well, one of the sort of most important issues for her students at the beginning of the course is not taking for granted a simple definition of natural intelligence, because before starting to talk about artificial intelligence, it is important to define intelligence. And sometimes the real problem is intelligence, not AI, but simply I. So not artificial intelligence, but just intelligence. So it's hard to critically define intelligence, and that needs to be done before talking any possible artificial application of intelligence, because so far before talking about, dreams or nightmares, we need first to talk about intelligence. And so we need to reopen that issue and not take intelligence for granted. We need, first of all, to understand what happens when we use intelligence. So the issue, well, in very basic terms, then is the following. And forgive me for sort of stating that so, simply. We need to consider our computational ability as the final parameter to define a human intelligence and human knowledge. Well, that seem to be the achievement of any form of human intelligence, or vice versa. Should we try to look into the basic elementary structure of our intelligence, in other words, in our way of existing and living, the key to understand the meaning of things. So our own tendency to ask the reason why for things. Is that the essence of intelligence? It's not because we know, it's not because we are knowledgeable that we're intelligent, but it's because we try to understand, we want to understand, we want to know. Because we can understand things when we have the intuition of the meaning, when we somehow experience that sparkle of the connection between things and our I and ourself. And I would like to quote a much more famous sort of philosopher who, in the 1700s, Descartes, started writing his philosophical meditation, and he made first a big mental experiment. And what if all was a dream, was a big sort of cheating, a swindle, if our body was nothing? But Descartes' strategy was to push doubt to the extreme in order to verify the existence of something. All doubts set aside. He was looking for a strategy to reappropriate of human knowledge, to rediscover human knowledge. And so if the high performances of AI and if transhumanist theories were interpreted as a mental experiment, not a project of reality, but just nothing but a mental experiment that is forcing us to re-understand or rediscover our sort of the most basic things of all. So who is really thinking? Thank you.
Ma guardate, io sono molto
Well, I'm very grateful to our guests because the challenge was not easy, but I think that we're all getting out of this room enriched and with clearer ideas, I think. And especially, I think there is one key take-home message because, as Costantino said, when we are faced with these topics, we may build walls because we feel afraid, we want to escape from these issues, or we may think that this is something that will happen in a very, very far future, or we should try to sort of let us be questioned, try to understand what is this all about. So these are big issues, certainly. We have just started a debate, and I hope that you will keep thinking and understanding and reflecting. And there are going to have more sessions during the meeting on these topics. We're going to have a session Wednesday morning about these topics with Father Benanti and many more. So this is an invitation also to better understand who we are, who am I, because there is something that remains at the end of this sort of knowledge rush. What is somehow irreducible, because there is a sort of irreducible element. There is not everything can be explained, and even the intuition cannot be fully explained. And also what Mark felt when his son sort of came to this world, and the reflections that were triggered in him is something that is not completely explainable. So we need to somehow come to terms and get to grips with our own self, these irreducible side that we all have. And this is something that we need to question. And this is a question we have to tackle. And again, Costantino said it very clearly. So again, this mating edition is an opportunity to rediscover ourself, our I, our relation to ourselves. We do not live in outer space. My presence is necessary to my existing and vice versa. So these days will be a great and valuable opportunity to better investigate these topics. And so where does my humanity stem from? So let's try to listen, to watch, to gaze in order to enrich ourselves, to grow somehow. And certainly, there are many things that are not artificial and that are valuable to us, like the mating itself. So I would like to remind you that if the mating has been existing for 40 years, it has been possible also thanks to the great deal of work done by so many people, by some voluntary workers, and also thanks to the willingness of many people who have been supporting the mating financially with donations. Donations are key in order to make it possible for the mating to continue. So please, if you can, make your donation and do it. There are specific places where you can do that in the mating area. So please give mating a chance, because it's important to keep events like this alive, to help us questioning ourselves. So please do not forget that. And I would like to thank you very much for your participation, and I wish you a great experience at this year's meeting. Thank you very much indeed for coming.